Hey everyone, this is Richard Rowland again. I wanted to do another video talking a little bit about the Akborida, this project that's coming out soon from Darkly Bright Press. I'm told it's going to be published on August the 1st. There are going to be 50 copies. There will be 20 signed hardbacks like this one, and then there will be 30 paperback copies. Christopher Tompkins, who runs Darkly Bright Press, sent me a written interview with some questions about the project and about my influences and kind of philosophy of writing, of storytelling in general. And I thought that it would actually be fun to read to you the responses that I gave to the interview. You'll be able to go to Christopher's website and read the interview if you just want the text, but I thought you guys might enjoy. I like to listen to things, so I thought you might enjoy that. So Christopher's first question for me, or Darkly Bright Press's first question for me, is Akborida is a tantalizing glimpse into a secret secondary world. What literary, historical, or spiritual figures have formed your imagination and inspired your desire to create a secondary world? Now, obviously, this is a big question. Of course, my debt to Tolkien is incalculable. I have a whole podcast about that. But as a writer, Tolkien's influence on me is exerted in a perhaps unusual way. I've always tried to tell stories and play with language even before I started reading Tolkien. But the true birth of mythopoeia in my life came when I read the appendices to The Lord of the Rings at about the age of 10, just as part of reading The Lord of the Rings. In the appendices, and I think this is in Appendix F, there's a note about the name of the river Baranduin, which Tolkien translates as Brandywine. When I first read this passage, it hit me like a thunderclap. I can still remember where I was sitting when I had this realization that you could name a river. And since that time, my private motto, which actually a sister of mine painted and onto like a landscape and put in a frame for me. It's over on that wall over there. My motto has been write because you can name a river. Right. So over the years, there are several other authors who have influenced my imagination in different but equally vital ways. Dante, to whom I owe much of my interior life, but also my sense of horror writing in particular. Lord Dunsany, E.R. Edison, Andrew Lang's The Colored Fairy books. I'm a somewhat unusual person in that I actually read these important authors only after I'd already read several medieval works in translation as a young man, like The Song of Roland, The Lay of the Cid, Volsunga Saga, Beowulf, Sir Gawain the Green Knight, Sir Orfeo, and so on. And what I found reading these later works, like Dunsany and E.R. Edison, Andrew Lang, is not only beauty and wonder, but also a kind of blueprint for how to make use of medieval sources in ways that were, let's say, different than, for instance, how Tolkien did them. I mean, Tolkien did it so perfectly and so well that Tom Shippey is fond of saying that every new fantasy writer, you have to spend your first book just getting Tolkien sort of out of your system so you can find what your own voice is. And then finally, I'm more or less a naturalized citizen of Narnia. I don't really recall a time in my life when I wasn't reading at least one Narnia book, and I consider the Narnia to be kind of the spiritual successor of the whole medieval tradition. Big fan. Maybe I will talk about that more later. All right, so the next question from Darkly Bright Press is this. I'd like to linger on the topic of secondary worlds. Personally, I contend there exists a great triumvirate of such literary paracosms of Tolkien's Middle-earth, Herbert's Dune, and Adam's Watership Down. In your opinion, why are we attracted to these complex creations? What vital purpose do they serve to a reader at the personal level, and what balm may they offer to a society in crisis? Okay, so I more or less agree with that triumvirate. I find Watership Down in particular to be one of the most delightful secondary worlds which I've ever encountered. As I often tell people, and this is only kind of half a joke, Watership Down has the most accurate depiction of rabbit religion that I've ever encountered anywhere. If I had to venture a guess as to why we are attracted to such creations, I would say that it's because we need them. But I think that authors and readers maybe need them in different but similar ways. Now, it would be easy here for me to make an appeal to Tolkien, his theory of subcreation, the case he lays out for that in On Fairy Stories. But I already have a podcast for doing that. And so I'm going to do something a little risky and try to share my own personal philosophy about these things, which is maybe a little jumbled, but I'm going to try to articulate it. So writers, or at least writers like me, build these worlds out of an almost existential necessity, right? Something on the order of the need for basic human goods like food and shelter. I'm not saying it's the same, but I mean, it's close to the same. Storytelling, which is the most profound kind of sense-making, is also just a basic human good. So for the creator or the sub-creator or the constructor of a paracosm, right, a parallel world, the act of writing is one of discovery. It's the attempt to discover what is true about your own world, and it's a way of sorting through two different and equally vexing problems. First of all, the fact that reality is too complex for us to easily understand, so this requires us to create narratives which help us understand it. And then the fact that without sufficient complexity, a narrative will have no ability, it'd be better to say without sufficient depth. Without sufficient depth, a narrative will have no ability to satisfy the deep-seated human need for verisimilitude. And therefore, these paracosms, these secondary worlds, have to possess a non-trivial degree of depth. Now, by depth, I mean the sense that the story and the world mean more than one thing. For example, one of the wonderful things that I love about reading Tolkien is that there's so much depth to what he's doing that it's not unreasonable to apply something like the medieval fourfold sense when you're reading it. This, I think, is something very close to Macken's idea of hieroglyphs in literature. The way that I would express it is this, that all of the really beautiful, lasting cultural artifacts, sacred scripture, liturgy, art, folk songs, traditional dance, and so on, are able to mean something both for the community that they hold together, and which preserve them preserves them, as well as for the individual who participates in them. And these meanings also are, let's say, for the group and then for the individual, are overlapping, but they're not quite the same. But then you also have, so that's like a inward outward dimension, but there's also an upward downward dimension, which is that the highest things, scripture and liturgy, are also capable of connecting us to a dimension which is beyond time. It can make something that happened 2,000 years ago closer to us than what happened yesterday. I can't tell you what I did at work most of the day yesterday, but I can tell you exactly where I was every Easter for the last several years of my life, right? The implicit hierarchy of these things makes it possible for what is lower to participate in what is higher. And so a healthy human culture, which isn't just religion, right? It's all these other things. Healthy human culture is a web of reference and relationships, which makes sense of the world's complexity without dissecting it or destroying its beauty. Now, I believe that the person who creates a paracosm or secondary world often does so because in their heart of hearts, they feel like this web has somehow become unraveled. When I was a young boy, I grew up in a sort of beige fundamentalist culture where the soft iconoclasm that we had meant that we had very few enduring cultural artifacts or a sense of what it meant to be ourselves. But I also lived proximate to a really vivid East Asian culture, which had a very strong sense of identity, a very strong sense of beauty, heart, honor, shame, family responsibility, and I adopted many of those values as my own. But I was always conscious of being an outsider. I turned to subcreation as an unconscious means of answering the question, what makes a culture and what would it mean to belong to one? So for the reader who enjoys such work, I expect there are going to be similar but somewhat different motivations. Tolkien's continuum, and it's very important that we see it as a continuum of escape, recovery, and consolation. Escape that brings us to recovery, that blossoms into consolation, is beautifully expressed in On Fairy Stories. And I'm not going to rehash it here, because again, I have another podcast for that. And I would also say, just on the reading front, that I've noticed that many of my friends enjoy reading for different reasons, or for reasons that seem to be different from my own. But if I had to sum up my intuition about why people would enjoy reading this kind of thing, right, and what balm it would offer you at the personal level, it would be this: that a story that's set in a vivid secondary world not only offers us a means of repairing the web that has come unraveled, but it also offers you communion with the other people who have shared your experience as a fellow reader, as a fellow traveler through that world. And this is why I think that at their best and at their worst, the great fandoms of genre literature tend to resemble religions. We can probably all think of some examples of that. To kind of sum this up, I would just say, for the lonely boy or girl languishing in suburbia, reading The Lord of the Rings won't just give you Middle-earth, it'll give you back your backyard. All right, so the next question from Darkly Bright Press. What I find most intriguing about your work is the approach. You often avoid common narrative forms by pushing to the foreground elements and techniques that many authors would consider backstory. Please discuss your goals in constructing the book in this manner. Okay, so some of the things that I'm going to say here are going to be basically a repeat of what I said in the previous video, because it's really the answer to this. But I'll go ahead and repeat it for those who didn't watch the previous video. So let's go back to the idea of the web of relationships and reference for a moment. Everything, this exists in literature and in art, so everything that is written in the English language is in some degree in a conversation with other things written in English, especially with certain key texts. And then additionally, those texts are going to extend beyond things originally composed in English to include all the great works of what we sometimes call the Western canon. I'm talking about the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Bible, stories of King Arthur, the Aeneid, Shakespeare, all that stuff. When people talk, write, or make movies or tell stories, they're drawing on this well, what Tolkien called the cauldron of story. It's also made up of, just like little local stories or, the stories your grandfather used to tell you. So that our stories are littered with what you could see as hyperlinks. Some of them work, some of them don't, some of them are functioning, some of them are broken, but our stories are full of these links. And if you know the older work that's being referenced or quoted, it enhances and enriches your enjoyment of the new work. For instance, nearly every classic Star Trek episode is a riff on some classical or medieval story. So knowing this makes it more enjoyable to watch, in my opinion. The older work, that older work is in turn also hyperlinked to a bunch of things older than it and so on. And this just goes back in sort of infinite or near infinite regression all the way back to the very first story, which philologists have speculated to be something like Hero slays Serpent, which is a perfect story arc. What this means is that the more you study stories, the more all of the stories kind of mean. You become immersed not just in one culture, but a sort of meta-culture, and you become enriched as a human being as a result. Lewis called this seeing with many eyes. I think that's from his essay, something like On the Reading of Old Books, Why You Should Read Old Books. It was actually originally the preface to a translation of St. Athanasius the Great's On the Incarnation of the Word, but it's worth reading. So usually fantasy and sci-fi authors try to create this effect for a world artificially. And they'll do this by creating a reference to another work, legend, or a text, or a song that doesn't actually exist, right? And so the example that I used yesterday is Frank Herbert's Dune. The heading of each chapter includes a short epigraph from a work of history written by the Princess Irulan. But all of those books written by the Princess Irulan don't exist anywhere except in those references and maybe in Frank Herbert's imagination. And this is a neat trick, right? It's a kind of sleight of hand that makes the world feel like it's got depth and history and tradition to it. It's a window dressing that serves the more important purpose of the story, which for Herbert is the novel that he's actually writing. And this makes sense, right? If he wants to convey this sense of dimensionality, of depth and breadth to his writers, then this is a good way to do that, because otherwise, like if he tried to actually go and write all of those books, he'd never finish his novel, which is one of the reasons I've rarely ever finished writing a novel. Well, I'm kind of weird in that I would kind of rather read all of those books that exist in the Dune universe, but which I can't read because they don't really exist, than I would read the novel Dune. And partly this is because I'm more interested to know what people who live in the world of Dune have to say about it than I am in what Frank Herbert has to say about it. Tolkien expressed this concept by saying that there is no tale without the teller. That, in other words, every story is told by someone, and that someone is a part of, participates in the tale that they are telling. You can think of it in terms of like quantum physics, right? With the effect that observers have on particles, right? Where the observation of the particle itself, you can know, for instance, like the location of something or the speed of something, but never both at the same time. The uncertainty principle and all these different things. I'm not a physicist, but I am very interested in physics, let's say. And one of the things that we've sort of learned is that the observer actually participates in the experiment. So you can never tell, in storytelling terms, you just very simply say, you can never tell an objective story, right? Every story is told by someone, and that someone is a part of or participates in the tale that they are telling. Well, all of this is a roundabout way of describing my project, which is basically this. What if every text was referenced by every other text? What if every text that was referenced by every other text actually existed? In other words, what if you just wrote it all and sort of wrote it in order so it built on itself? And in short, that's what I've been doing for the last 20 years. And that means that in one way, there's no good place to start. But on the other hand, it also means that anywhere is a good place to start. It's sort of like reading the great books. You could start right back at the very beginning with the Iliad or something like that. But actually, you can just start wherever seems interesting to you because they're all connected to each other. So you could start somewhere in the middle and kind of read your way out, if that makes sense. Okay, so the next question from Darkly Bright Press is that Akborida is comprised of both prose and song. How do these forms interact to construct myth? Now, I suspect most of us who are into this kind of literature have already read Albert Lord's The Singer of Tales. Now, if you haven't, you should pause this interview right now and go and seek it out. Lord's work concerns the way that oral cultures develop into literary cultures. And it was, for me, what Joseph Campbell's The Hero with a Thousand Faces was for a bunch of my other writer friends. Obviously that's a... Hero with a Thousand Faces is, if you don't know, it's sort of a theory about how myths work and how stories work, and there are a lot of problems with it. I get irritated because people try to use it too much. It's a classic example of like you have a hammer and suddenly everything looks like at a nail. But it is an interesting read. But I can remember, many of the people in my life who are close to me who are writers. I can remember the day, the week that they read Hero with a Thousand Faces for the first time because it's so convincing. Lord's book for me was very similar in that although a lot of Lord's research and many of his conclusions are now considered to be very outdated, it was for me a very riveting and utterly convincing read. So my basic belief, which comes from Lord, but also from having grown up with a discipline of, for instance, reading and praying the Psalms on a daily basis, is that poetry is debased song and prose is debased poetry. Human cultures preserve what is vital and sacred to them first through song and only much later through written prose. Poetry, when it's written self-consciously as poetry, is a sort of it's an attempt to elevate prose back towards that, right? It's an attempt, maybe not a totally honest attempt, but it's an attempt to create a literary artifact using an oral mode. Now, my modus operandi for creating secondary worlds is what I have sometimes called poetry first world building. And it's a terrible idea. I don't recommend it. It's great fun, but I don't recommend it. But the way that it works is this. Whenever I want to answer the question, what happened in such and such a place and at such and such a time, I try to situate myself in the role of someone recording an older oral tradition preserved in song. And I use very basic meters for this, very certain metrical style, but I also use a vocabulary and things like epic similes and phrasing and things like this that come from real world poetry that at least interacts more with that older oral tradition. Once I've written that song in one or more versions, I will usually let that question lie, sometimes for several years at a time. And when I return to it, I will try to take my oral versions and construct from them a prose narrative. Sometimes I will then rewrite that prose narrative multiple times, and I'll always try to preserve the previous versions to sort of create this layered effect, right? The sense of a whole textual tradition instead of just a single authoritative text. And the final stage is the composition of new poetry. And for this, I'll use more advanced or modern metrical forms than the earlier oral work, which the idea is here to sort of represent the efforts of high culture, literary culture, to sort of reappropriate their old myths and legends for themselves as poetry. And along the way, if you do this, you'll create new links to other cultural artifacts, which were being developed in the meantime, both by you and then within the frame of the world. And these links are constantly being created and then forgotten, because you'll create stuff and forget about it. And what this does is it sort of over time, it produces a sense of the messiness that real historical traditions, things like the legends around the figure of King Arthur, that real historical traditions have. And as I sort of alluded to earlier, this kind of process is a great way to ensure that you never finish anything. But it is a lot of fun. So the next question from Darkly Bright Press is, alongside writers such as Nicholas Kotar, you are a Christian who creates in the fantasy genre. What can fantasy achieve for the Christian reader? What are the potential pitfalls that you see? Okay, so you mentioned Nicholas Kotar, who's of course a deacon in the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia. He's also a good friend of mine. And I am also, as most people know, an Orthodox Christian. It seems to me that Orthodox Christianity bears an important witness to the symbolic, mystical, and iconic potential of the created order that's in desperate need of rediscovery in the West right now. Eastern Christianity faced two extremely violent bouts of iconoclasm during the 8th and the 9th centuries AD. And as a result, the fathers of the Eastern Church, notably St. John of Damascus, St. Theodore the Studite, carefully articulated the Christian stance on the image, on human artistic endeavor, and on the stuff of the created world, bread, wine, oil, water, and its potential to communicate the grace of God. So the position of the Eastern Fathers was that because God the Word had taken matter irrevocably to himself, right? Christ still has his body, right? Matter itself could not be considered evil or unworthy of bearing the image of God. And among other things, this means that it is possible to know God with our bodies as well as with our minds. And there's there's this passage in St. John of Damascus, which I'll read to you. It's an eerie prediction of much modern Christian worship as it stands now. St. John says, if you say that God ought only to be apprehended spiritually, then take away everything bodily, the lights, the fragrant incense, even vocal prayer, the divine mysteries themselves that are celebrated with matter, the bread, the wine, the oil of chrismation, and the form of the cross. So Heather Ward has something similar in mind when she describes Christian fantasy writing as, she calls it the outcome of an imagination that works in sacramental terms, seeing the material world as participant in and mediator of the divine. And this, I think, is the important link between fantasy writing and traditional liturgical Christianity. Tolkien argues that fantasy is made out of the primary world, and he says, but a good craftsman loves his material and has a knowledge and a feeling for clay, stone, and wood, which only the art of making can give. So in our post-industrial suburban dystopia, reclaiming this love for the goodness of the material world while still keeping the material properly ordered, right, in relation to that which is higher, is absolutely vital to healing what seems to be, to me, to be one of our deepest wounds, which is a kind of Gnosticism, which has crept in and convinced us that whatever we do with our bodies is not really spiritual, and so it's not really genuine, and then further convinced us that our brains are not really part of our bodies. So the things that I think up here, that's faith. But if I do something with my body to serve God, then that's works. Right? But actually your brain is part of your body. Thinking is a physical action, right? It's more than that, but it's not less. So for the Christian of, of Catholic tradition, little c, let's say, Fantasy literature serves to orient us towards the sacramental and the incarnational nature of our faith. In other words, it orients us towards the altar. For Christians coming from maybe Reformed or evangelical backgrounds who may not have this available to them yet, fantasy literature can be an absolute lifeline, and it certainly was that for me for the first 20 years of my life. Now, I see the potential pitfalls of fantasy as twofold. First of all, there always is the danger for both writer and reader of just becoming lost in these intricate imaginary worlds to some greater or lesser degree. And the fear of this is behind so much worrying about escapism in fantasy literature. I mean, I'm the co-host of the Em and Sewell podcast. Probably every other email we get is about this question, right? How much fantasy is it okay for me to read, right? And of course, the answer is it depends. And while such criticisms about escapism and whatnot are poorly thought out or expressed very often, there are a relatively small number of people for whom this is a real danger. And most of us have probably met someone for whom it was a real danger. And I would say that those who are most in danger in this regard are those who are deeply, let's say, wounded individuals who have nothing beautiful in their own lives, which fantasy can help them to recover. But even here, I don't think the danger is really fantasy literature. The bad kind of escapism, mostly these days, comes from our mobile phones, from video games, from TV shows, and from the overwhelming Brobdingnagian, crushing consumerism of our age. The second pitfall is pride, right? Pride strikes at writers and artists for obvious reasons. I don't think I need to explain that. But it also may manifest itself in readers, in the tendency to want to display mastery within the context of a community of readers or viewers. And so much of the ugly tug of war around the Amazon Prime Rings of Power show, for instance, within the Tolkien community, seems to be born out of this kind of pride and possessiveness. Not only is this sort of pride, speaking as a Christian, soul-destroying, it also runs the risk of really negating any positive benefit you might have been deriving from the literature itself. Okay. Next question from Darkly Bright Press. Strikingly, the verse in Akborida is not only heroic, but also bears a liturgical nature. Why is this important to you? What function does liturgy provide for the secondary world? Okay. I mentioned earlier that one way to understand the world under starlight is as an attempt to create a culture, and in so doing, to understand what it is that holds people together and gives them an identity. I've become convinced, because of my own religious and, I don't know what to say, like mystical experiences. I'm putting that in air quotes because I probably don't mean by mystical what you think I mean, but different discussion. Right, but I've become convinced that no culture can really exist without a sacred story, which people can not only learn or hear performed, but in which they themselves can participate, and so have their identity sort of conferred upon them from above. And pretty much all of the landmark fantasy literature up to the time of the Inklings was written by Christians who primarily encountered their faith in a liturgical context. Even when this is not the case, there's still enough liturgy sort of in the air of Western civilization that the exposure was unavoidable. And so we could say that an author like Tolkien can be said to be using a liturgical framework, even if his work itself doesn't include a lot of liturgy, though there is some. Well, a lot has changed since then, especially here in the United States, where actually most of us, our sort of underlying religious assumptions are congregationalist, low church, non-sacramental, etc., revivalist. If we want to communicate this sense of recovery, of communion, and of community, I believe that we need to start being a little more deliberate about how we do it. You could say, on a meta level also, there's the fact that liturgy shapes patterns of thought and being, and therefore many important works of world literature, things like the Apocalypse of St. John, which is of course part of sacred scripture, all the way up to the Old English poem Andreas, right? These may be said to be liturgically structured. And if you want to create this kind of effect in your own secondary world, you will first actually have to figure out what kind of liturgy has been shaping hearts and minds, and then ask the question, how does that shape hearts and minds? and then figure out what it would look like to create a world and to create literature and create a culture that's been shaped by that liturgy. But here we can't draw from an empty well. We're going to need to live rich and full liturgical lives of our own. And here I believe that Orthodox Christian writers whose tradition, our tradition has sort of uniquely preserved a robust liturgical theology. Not to say that other traditions aren't working to rediscover it or anything like that, but I do think that something special has been preserved in the East, and that we're uniquely poised to offer something to the world in this regard. And finally, through the creation of liturgical, devotional, and mystagogical texts, we are able to explore the question, what would the interior and devotional life of someone who lives in this world be like? And that's a question that I find both profitable to ask, because it reveals things about my own interior and devotional life, or lack thereof, but also just very interesting. All right, final question. Darkly Bright Press asks, finally, I am most attracted to literature which employs symbology to describe truth. I detect this quality in Akborida. Without unveiling the mysteries, please discuss your thoughts on how you may communicate the deepest unseen realities to the reader through story and song. There's a question. Okay. As I said, you can't draw from an empty well. The kind of writing which I've described in this interview, and in which I try to engage, is an ascetic act. It requires the rejection of a great many things, most of all, the desire to be read. If I can unveil just like a very small mystery here. In the Amborian liturgical day, the Ambori are the culture with which the Akborida deals. The very first service of the day, we could liken it to Vespers. It's held at kind of a similar time, is called the opening of the book. And in the ceremony, which is kept very secret, and so is attended only by a few, there are certain hymns concerning love which are sung, at the culmination of which a book called the Queen's Book, is raised from its resting place within a sort of stone coffin or chamber, and its heavy covering of animal skins is removed. The book is opened, and it remains open until the conclusion of that day's prayers. And this book is full of many mysterious things, which only really find their meaning through the careful observance of and participation in the whole sacred story of the year. The point that I'm trying to get at is this, that the book that is within the author should remain hidden, nurtured and growing until it is drawn out of its hiding place by an act of love which is able to reveal it to its audience. This audience does not need to be the whole world. In fact, I've come to believe that most of us would be better off writing only for a very small number of people, at least for most of our lives. But whoever the audience is, they must be those who will not speak of thy mysteries unto thine enemies, as it were. After this, mass publishing might or might not come. But when it comes, whenever that comes, it's going to be very difficult to ever grow the book, right, the thing, beyond what it was when it first saw the light of day. Sort of by exposure, it becomes ossified, right? It turns to stone. So the period of incubation is key. One of my favorite phrases from Lewis is from Till We Have Faces, in which Orual, the main character, says, I was with book as a woman is with child, which is a great phrase. While your story is still in that deep, silent, hidden, womb-like place, you have to feed it on yourself, on your own interior life of prayer, on your suffering, on your joy, the way that a woman sustains her child. This will give your life, your book, life and form. And because man is a microcosm, a book that contains a man contains the whole cosmos. As I've said before, I learned the hard way. Talked about this a little in the previous episode. I learned the hard way that it's better not to share things like The World Under Starlight, except with a few close friends, until the time is right. And in this case, it was an act of love in this case Christopher's friendship, which drew this book up out of its hiding place. Akborida is only one small part of it, but I am very excited to share it with Darkly Bright's readers, and I hope you've enjoyed this interview. Akborida will be coming out August 1st, or the Feast of the Procession of the Holy Cross in our calendar. So Akborida will be coming out August the 1st, and if you enjoyed this little sort of monologue dialogue about stories and storytelling, and you want to hear more of these things, and specifically thoughts on fantasy literature, you can check out my other work on the Em and Sewell podcast. And also, if you like this kind of thing, you might also enjoy the Universal History series, which I've done with Jonathan Pajot, all of which I will link to below. I think that's it. So anyway, I hope that you enjoy this interview, that you'll enjoy the book, and that if you do enjoy the book, let Darkly Bright Press know, and maybe we'll be able to do some more things like this. Thanks.